Caleb Blackridge didn't knock. That was the first thing Eliza noticed, the way he pushed open the door to her family's kitchen like he already owned it, like the threshold meant nothing, like she meant nothing. He walked in with two men behind him, both of them carrying the particular kind of silence that belongs to people paid to be present and say nothing. Caleb himself moved through the room the way a man moves through a space he's already decided to take. He looked at the plates on the shelf, the crack in the plaster wall, the flour dust on the table. He looked at all of it before he looked at her. Then he said, "Turn around." Eliza was 24 years old. She had been preparing for this meeting for 2 weeks. Her mother had pressed her dress 3 times. Her father had told her twice that morning to smile, to be pleasant, to remember what was at stake. She turned around. Caleb Blackridge studied her for a moment. Then he turned to her father and said, "She's not what I expected." He didn't say it quietly. If you have ever stood in a room while someone looked at you like a piece of furniture that didn't match, you know exactly what Eliza felt in that moment. If you've ever been told, without a single word spoken directly to you, that you are not enough, then this story is already yours. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Because what happens next is the kind of thing people don't forget. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Vance Ranch sat 7 miles outside of Red Hollow on a stretch of land that had once been promising. That was the word Eliza's father used when he talked about it, promising, as though the land itself had made him a guarantee and simply failed to deliver. There were 40 acres of it, mostly dry, with a creek that ran reliably in spring and slowed to a reluctant trickle by August. The main house had 4 rooms and a barn that leaned slightly to the east, as if the whole structure had spent 20 years trying to walk away and never quite managed it. Eliza had grown up in that house knowing 2 things simultaneously, that her family loved her and that her family didn't know what to do with her. She was not the daughter her parents had imagined. She wasn't delicate in the way the women of Red Hollow were supposed to be delicate. She was tall, broader through the shoulder than her mother thought appropriate, and she had a habit of saying exactly what she thought at moments when silence would have served her better. Her hands were always busy, baking, fixing, building small things that needed building. She had taught herself to keep accounts by the time she was 16 because her father had a generous heart and a poor head for numbers, and someone had to know what was actually owed. She was, in short, a practical woman who had learned to make herself useful because useful was the one thing no one could argue with. But in Red Hollow, useful wasn't the currency that mattered. What mattered was the kind of softness that made men comfortable, the kind of silence that made powerful people feel unchallenged. Eliza had neither, and she had known for years that this was considered a deficiency. What she hadn't expected was for that deficiency to become the family's financial crisis. The debt had accumulated slowly, the way debt always does. A dry season here, a broken fence there, a sick mare that cost more to treat than she was worth, a loan from the territorial bank that her father had taken out with the confidence of a man who believed the next year would be better. The next year was not better. Neither was the one after that. By the time Eliza was 23, the ranch owed more than it would sell for, and the bank had begun sending letters that used words like final notice and immediate action required. Her father, Thomas Vance, was not a bad man. He was a man who had run out of options and then made the kind of decision that men make when they're desperate, and the decision involves someone else's life. He went to see Gerald Blackridge. The Blackridge family owned approximately 1/3 of the productive land in the Red Hollow territory. They owned the grain mill, a controlling share of the only bank, and enough goodwill from the territorial governor to make things happen or stop happening, depending on what suited them. Gerald Blackridge was 61 years old, had buried 1 wife and driven away 2 business partners, and had raised a son named Caleb who had inherited his father's certainty without inheriting any of the intelligence that made the certainty occasionally justified. Thomas Vance arrived at the Blackridge house with his hat in his hands, which was not a figure of speech. He literally held it in his hands the entire visit, turning it in slow circles, and when he left 2 hours later, he had agreed to bring his daughter to meet Caleb the following Sunday. He did not ask Eliza first. He told her Thursday evening after supper while her mother was still at the table. He told her carefully, with the particular care of a man presenting an unpleasant thing as if it were a gift. He talked about the debt. He talked about the land. He talked about how Caleb Blackridge was 28 and needed a wife, and how the Blackridges had indicated they would consider absorbing the ranch's debt as part of any arrangement. He talked about security and stability and the future. He did not use the word sold, but Eliza was 24 years old and she had been keeping the family's accounts for 8 years. She understood exactly what the numbers meant. She said, "You want me to marry a man I've never met so the bank doesn't take our land?" Thomas Vance looked at his hat. "I want you to meet him. Just meet him. That's all I'm asking." Her mother, Ruth, set down her fork with a small, precise click. "It's a good family, Eliza, a very good family. You could have a comfortable life." "I could have a transaction," Eliza said. Neither of her parents answered that directly. She agreed to go. She agreed because she was practical, and because she understood that refusing to even appear would cost her family something they couldn't afford to lose, and because some part of her, the part that had spent her whole life trying to make herself useful enough to justify the space she took up, believed that perhaps the meeting would be different from what she feared. It was not different. Caleb Blackridge arrived at the Vance kitchen on a Sunday morning in late April with 2 men and no particular expression on his face. He was tall, well-dressed, and had the particular confidence of a person who has never been seriously refused anything. He looked around the kitchen the way you look around a place you're thinking of purchasing. Then he looked at Eliza the same way. "Turn around," he said. She turned around. She hated herself for it a little, even as she did it. He studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke to her father as though Eliza were not standing 4 feet away. "She's not what I expected," he said. "She's bigger than I thought, and that—" He gestured vaguely toward her face. "I don't know what she's been doing to herself, but she'll need to fix that before any formal arrangement." Eliza's mother made a small sound. Not quite a protest, not quite agreement. Her father said, "She's a hard worker, very capable." "I'm not looking for a farmhand," Caleb said flatly. Something happened in Eliza's chest in that moment. Not anger exactly, or not only anger. It was more like something that had been bent for a very long time, finally reaching the angle at which it either breaks or straightens. She looked at Caleb Blackridge directly. He hadn't looked at her directly once since he walked in. "What exactly are you looking for?" she said. He did look at her then. He seemed mildly surprised that she'd spoken. "Excuse me. You said you're not looking for a farmhand. I'm asking what you're looking for, since you seem to be shopping." The 2 men behind Caleb shifted slightly. Her mother made the sound again. Her father said her name in a low, warning voice. Caleb's expression didn't change much, but his eyes did. A small hardening, the look of a man encountering something he doesn't quite have a category for. "You've got a mouth on you," he said. Not quite an insult, more of an observation, as though he was adding it to a mental list of deficiencies. "I've got opinions," Eliza said. "Same thing, in some company." "Eliza." Her father's voice was sharper now. She turned to look at him, and that was when she felt it fully. The weight of what he'd done, and the weight of what he was asking her to accept, and the weight of how much he needed her to be quiet and agreeable, and small enough to fit inside this man's requirements. And she loved her father. She genuinely loved him. That was the part that made it so hard. Not that he was cruel, but that he was frightened, and he had found a solution, and the solution required her to disappear into it. She turned back to Caleb. "I'm not going to change how I look," she said. "I'm not going to change how I speak. If those are your requirements, then I'm afraid I'm not what you're looking for, and we're both wasting a Sunday morning." The silence in the kitchen was the particular kind that has texture. You could feel it against your skin. Caleb looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Thomas Vance. "You need to have a conversation with your daughter," he said. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it without being invited to. "When she's ready to have a proper discussion, you can come see us." He walked to the door, opened it himself, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. The 2 men filed out behind him. The door closed. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Ruth Vance pressed both hands flat on the table and said, in a voice that was entirely controlled and entirely devastated, "Eliza, do you understand what you just did?" "Yes," Eliza said. "We are going to lose this land." "Maybe," Eliza said, "but I'm not going to lose myself to keep it." Her mother stood up and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Her father sat at this table for a long time, still holding his hat, looking at the floor. Eliza stood where she was. She waited to feel certain about what she'd done. The certainty didn't come. Not clean, not clear. What came instead was something more complicated. The knowledge that she had told the truth, and that telling the truth had costs, and that she was going to have to pay them. She was right about that. Within 3 days, the story had traveled through Red Hollow the way all stories travel in small towns, faster than any wagon, more distorted with each telling. By the time it reached the far end of Main Street, Eliza Vance had apparently screamed at Caleb Blackridge, thrown something, and accused his family of fraud. None of that had happened, but the details were secondary to the overall impression. She had humiliated a Blackridge. She had refused a deal. She had, in the accounting of Red Hollow society, committed an act of profound and unforgivable arrogance. Her family's few remaining customers at the small trade they did, eggs, occasional baked goods, some dried herbs her mother grew, began to find other sources. The feed store started requiring payment in advance where they'd offered credit before. The woman who lived nearest, a widow named Clara Marsh, who had been something like a friend to Eliza's mother, crossed the street to avoid them in town. Thomas Vance did not shout at Eliza. He was not that kind of man. He was quieter than that, and the quiet was worse than shouting would have been. He moved through the house with the careful movements of a man carrying something heavy in his chest, and when he looked at Eliza, it was with an expression she recognized and couldn't stand. Not hatred, not anger, but grief. She had taken something from him, and he was grieving it, and he needed her to understand that, and she did understand it, and understanding it didn't change what she'd done. Ruth was more direct. Ruth Vance had come to the frontier from a family that had known better times, and she had built her sense of dignity entirely around managing appearances, around being seen correctly, around the specific social arithmetic of who was above you and who was below you, and how to position yourself accordingly. What Eliza had done violated every principle Ruth understood about survival. She didn't see it as her daughter protecting herself. She saw it as her daughter destroying the family out of stubbornness. "You are not as special as you think," Ruth told her one evening, 2 weeks after the Blackridge meeting. They were in the kitchen. Eliza was making bread. The one thing she did that her mother never criticized, because the bread was genuinely excellent, and even Ruth couldn't argue with a good loaf. "You are 24 years old and you have nothing. No husband, no money, no prospects. And you turned down the one man who might have what?" Eliza said. She kept working the dough. "Owned me?" "Don't be dramatic." "I'm being accurate." "You are being selfish." Ruth's voice had the particular flatness of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and sees no point in discussing it further. "Your father is 53 years old. His back is bad. We are going to lose this land, and we are going to lose it because you couldn't manage to be agreeable for 1 hour. Eliza pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and said nothing. "You need to make this right," Ruth said. "You go to the Blackridge house. You apologize. You tell him you were overwrought, that you didn't mean what you said, and then you—" "No," Eliza said. The word was quiet. It was not dramatic. It was simply the word that was true. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she left the room. This was the pattern for weeks. Her father's grief, her mother's pressure, the town's hostility, and Eliza standing in the middle of it trying to hold on to the version of herself that had said no in that kitchen on a Sunday morning. The version felt further away every day, not because she doubted the decision, but because the cost kept arriving, in small, steady, grinding installments. And there is only so long a person can pay a cost before they start to wonder if the thing they protected was worth protecting. She started to slip. It happened slowly enough that she didn't notice it happening. She began waking at 4 a.m, lying in the dark listening to the sounds of a house that felt like it was holding its breath. She ate less. She worked more, trying to be useful enough to compensate for what she'd cost them, waking before dawn to do chores, staying up late to mend things, picking up every small task she could find because movement was easier than stillness, and stillness was when the doubt came for her. Her mother began suggesting things, small changes, the way Eliza wore her hair, the way she spoke to people in town, the need to be softer, quieter, less direct. And Eliza, who was tired and already worn and desperately wanted to stop costing her family something every day, began to make the changes. Not all at once, not consciously, but one small concession led to another, and by the time 2 months had passed, Eliza Vance had become a quieter, smaller, more careful version of herself. And no one in her family noticed because it was exactly what they'd been hoping for. She noticed, but she told herself it was temporary. The day she walked 7 miles alone because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the ranch and wasn't the town, she didn't plan it. She just started walking north into the dry grass and scrub and kept going until the effort of walking was the only thing she could feel. And then she kept going past that, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant adding up everything she'd given away in the past 2 months and arriving at a number she wasn't ready to face. She stopped eventually. Not by choice. Her legs simply went. She sat down in the dry grass with her knees folded under her and her hands in her lap and looked at the open sky above the plain and felt, for the first time in 2 months, completely honest with herself. She was disappearing, not dying, not defeated. Disappearing, becoming less of herself, one small agreement at a time, until eventually there would be nothing left that Caleb Blackridge or anyone else could object to, because there would be nothing left at all. She sat there a long time. She didn't hear the horse approaching until it was close. The man who dismounted was not from Red Hollow. She was certain of that, not because she knew every face in the territory, but because he didn't look at her the way Red Hollow people looked at her lately, which was with the particular discomfort of people who've been told to regard someone as a cautionary tale. He looked at her instead the way you look at someone you found in a place they probably shouldn't be, with the straightforward concern of a person who sees a problem and is trying to determine its nature. "You hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She had the feeling he was deciding whether to believe her. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. "I know." He didn't ask what she was doing out here. He didn't offer an opinion about it. He simply looked at the horizon and then back at her and said, "I've got water, if you need it." She needed it. She took the canteen he offered and drank, and then sat there holding it, and something about the absence of judgment, the complete ordinary absence of anyone trying to fix her, or improve her, or manage her, made her eyes fill in a way she absolutely did not want them to. She blinked it back. "I'm fine," she said, handing the canteen back. "All right," he said. He didn't argue with her. His name, she learned later, was Colton Hayes, and he ran cattle on the northern plains, and he had absolutely no opinion about what had happened between Eliza Vance and Caleb Blackridge, because he didn't know anything about it. Which meant, for the first time in 2 months, she was just a woman sitting in a field. She didn't know yet what that would come to mean. She didn't know that he was going to be the person who handed her back the version of herself she'd been quietly surrendering. She didn't know any of what was coming. She only knew that he'd offered her water without asking her to be different first, and that, in this particular season of her life, was the most unexpected thing anyone had done for her. Colton Hayes did not offer to take her home. That was the second thing Eliza noticed about him. The first being the water, offered without conditions. He didn't assume she needed rescuing. He didn't look at a woman sitting alone in a dry field 7 miles from the nearest building and immediately begin organizing a solution. He stood beside his horse and drank from the canteen himself after she handed it back, and he looked out at the plain the same way she'd been looking at it, as if it was a view worth considering. "You live out this way?" he said eventually. "No," she said. "Red Hollow, south." He nodded. Didn't say anything else for a moment. "You walking back?" Eliza looked at her legs. They had stopped shaking, but she wouldn't have called them reliable. "Eventually," she said. He seemed to weigh something. "I'm heading south. I can take you as far as the creek road." It wasn't an offer wrapped in concern or charity. It was a practical statement. He was going that direction. There was a horse. The arithmetic was simple. Eliza appreciated the arithmetic. "All right," she said. She stood up on the first try, which she was grateful for. He didn't move to help her. She got herself upright and brushed the dry grass from her skirt, and he held the horse steady while she mounted, then swung up behind her with the practiced ease of a man who spent most of his life on horseback. He kept a careful distance between them, not performatively careful, just decent. They rode south without talking much. The silence was the comfortable kind, which surprised her. She had spent 2 months in silences that felt like accusations. This one felt like weather. Just a condition, nothing personal. "What do you run?" she said after a while. "Cattle, northern range up past Millhaven Creek." "That's hard country." "It is," he agreed. "Good grass, though, when it rains." "When it rains," she repeated. "When it rains," he said, and she heard the dry humor in it, the acknowledgement that when it rains was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She almost smiled. She couldn't remember the last time she'd almost smiled. He left her at the creek road as promised, tipping his hat and turning north again without ceremony. She watched him go for a moment, then turned south toward the ranch and started walking the last 2 miles home with the strange, fragile feeling of someone who has just been treated like an ordinary person after a long time of being treated like a problem. She didn't tell her mother where she'd been. She washed her face, put on an apron, and started on the evening meal. Her mother came into the kitchen while she was working and looked at her with the measuring look she'd developed over the past months, assessing, calculating, looking for signs of the kind of behavior that had started all of this. "You were gone all afternoon," Ruth said. "I was walking." "Where?" "North," Eliza said. "Just north." Her mother pressed her lips together in the way that meant she had several things to say and was choosing the order carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell told me this morning that Caleb Blackridge has been seen with the Fenner girl from Mill Haven." Eliza set down the knife she was using. "Good for her," she said. "Eliza, I mean that sincerely, Mama. I hope she knows what she's agreeing to." "She's agreeing to security," Ruth said. "She's agreeing to a future. That's what women in this territory need, whether you want to hear it or not." Eliza picked up the knife again. "Then I'll find my own future," she said. "With what?" Her mother's voice cracked slightly on the words. It wasn't anger. It was something rawer than anger, closer to fear. "You have nothing, Eliza. We have nothing. Your father went to see the bank yesterday, and they have given us 60 days. 60 days before they begin proceedings on the property. What future are you going to find in 60 days? Eliza kept working. The rhythm of the knife was something to hold on to. "I don't know yet," she said. Her mother left the kitchen. Eliza cooked dinner. Nobody talked much at the table. Her father ate slowly and said the food was good, which was true, and which was the one peace offering he knew how to make. She took it for what it was. She lay awake that night adding up numbers in her head. Not the ranch's debt numbers. She'd memorized those months ago and couldn't unmake them. Different numbers. Smaller, more personal ones. How much flour they had. How long it would stretch. How much a decent loaf could sell for at the mining camp south of Ridgeback if someone brought it fresh. She'd heard the miners up there paid well for food that wasn't hardtack and salt pork. She'd heard it and filed it away the way she filed away anything that might be useful someday. Someday felt like it was getting close. She saw Colton Hayes again 2 weeks later, not by arrangement, but because Red Hollow was the only town within a half-day's ride in any direction, and eventually everyone who needed supplies ended up at the same counter at Mercer's General Store. She was buying what the household budget allowed, which was not much. He was at the far end of the counter negotiating the price of a barrel of salt pork with old Mercer, who negotiated everything as a matter of principle, regardless of whether the price was already fair. He noticed her first. He raised his chin in the brief upward nod that men on the frontier used as a greeting when both hands were occupied. She nodded back. She paid for her goods and was wrapping them in cloth when he came down the counter. "Feeling better?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, because it was true and because she'd decided she was done being smaller than she was, "Thank you for the water." "Didn't cost me anything," he said. It wasn't dismissive, it was just honest. She looked at him more directly than she'd allowed herself to in their first meeting, when she'd been too tired and too rattled to look at much of anything properly. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed. Brown hair, a face that had spent considerable time in weather, and the particular posture of someone who had learned to carry his own weight early and kept doing it. There was nothing performed about him, no calculation in his expression, just a man who'd asked how she was doing and meant the question exactly as much as it sounded. "I've been thinking," she said, and then stopped, because she wasn't sure why she was saying this to someone she'd met once in a field. But he said, "About what?" with the tone of someone who actually wanted to know. And so she told him. She told him about the mining camps, about the bread, about the numbers she'd been running in her head. She told him practically and concisely, laying it out the way she laid out the ranch accounts, because that was how she thought best, in terms of what was real and what was possible. He listened the way good listeners do, without filling in her pauses, without nodding too eagerly, without offering an opinion until she'd finished. When she finished, he said, Ridgeback Camp is about 18 miles east. Road's rough past the third creek. I know, she said. I'd need a way to get the goods there reliably. What kind of volume are you thinking? She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then, I run past Ridgeback twice a month. Could take on a delivery if the load was manageable. Eliza looked at him. Why would you do that? He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated. Because it's a reasonable business arrangement, he said. You'd pay for the freight. I'm going that way regardless. It was not a grand gesture. It was not charity dressed up as something else. It was a man looking at a practical problem and offering a practical piece of the solution with the same economy he'd offered water in a field. Let me work out the numbers, she said. That's sensible, he said, and went back to his argument with Mercer about the salt pork. She walked home with her small bundle of goods, and for the first time in months, felt something she recognized as forward motion. The problem was that forward motion in Red Hollow attracted attention, and attention from Red Hollow had not been friendly. She didn't tell her parents what she was planning, not at first. She had learned that plans announced before they had any substance gave people something to dismantle before the thing could stand on its own. Instead, she worked quietly, calculating ingredient costs, figuring quantities, estimating how many loaves she could produce from what they had, and what she could buy on what little credit she could access. She baked 3 test batches, kept meticulous notes, adjusted. Her mother watched all of this with the particular suspicion of someone who has been disappointed before and is conserving their hope accordingly. On the third morning, Ruth came into the kitchen before dawn and found Eliza already working, the second batch of the day rising near the stove. What is this? Ruth said. A plan, Eliza said. She explained it. Her mother listened with her arms folded across her chest, and Eliza watched the expressions move across her face. Skepticism, discomfort, a flicker of something that might have been interest quickly suppressed. The Blackridges own the mill, Ruth said when Eliza finished. Gerald Blackridge sets the flour prices. I know, Eliza said. I'll source from Dunner's Mill in Calvert, 40 miles north. They're cheaper anyway, and the grind is finer. 40 miles. Colton Hayes runs past there twice a month. He can bring the supply back. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Who is Colton Hayes? A rancher, Northern Range. He's reliable. You seem certain of that for someone you've met twice. Eliza thought about a man who offered water without making it a negotiation. I have a sense of it, she said. Ruth unfolded her arms and refolded them, which meant she was shifting from dismissal toward reluctant consideration. And you think the miners will pay what you're asking? I think they'll pay more than that, Eliza said. I've been talking to Isaac Pruitt at the feed store. He goes out there for hardware runs and he says the men working the Ridgeback camp haven't had decent food in 4 months. Their camp cook quit and nobody's replaced him. They're eating salt pork and whatever the supply wagons bring, and the supply wagons are unreliable. She looked at her mother steadily. Good bread isn't a luxury to a man doing hard physical work. It's fuel. I'm going to give them fuel and they're going to pay for it. Her mother looked at her for a long time. Then she said, If this fails, we will be in worse position than we are now. If we do nothing, we lose the land in 60 days, Eliza said. This is 60 days of trying something. Ruth's jaw tightened. Then she turned and picked up an apron from the hook on the wall. Then show me the recipe, she said. They worked together for the first time in months without fighting. It wasn't warm exactly. Ruth Vance had not suddenly become someone who found it easy to show tenderness. But it was real. Her mother's hands knew what they were doing. She had been a good baker once, before the ranch absorbed every hour, and the knowledge came back to her quickly. They worked in parallel, flour-dusted, and quiet, and Eliza let herself feel something about that without examining it too closely. Her father came down at sunup, found them working, and asked no questions. He simply poured himself coffee and sat at the table and watched, and after a while he said, I can build you a second rack for cooling, if that would help. It would help. Eliza told him so. He went to the barn and came back with wood and spent the morning building it with the careful attention of a man who needed to be useful and was grateful for the chance. She met Colton at Mercer's at the agreed time 2 days later, and they laid out the terms of the arrangement across the counter with Mercer as an uninterested witness, which felt more official than it probably was. Colton would carry her supply order from Dunner's Mill twice a month and deliver her finished product to Ridgeback Camp on his way through. She would pay him a freight rate he named, which was fair, and she would absorb any loss if the goods didn't sell, which was her risk to take. "And if it works," he said. "Then we renegotiate," she said. He nodded. "That's fair." The first delivery went out 10 days later. 48 loaves, 2 dozen small rolls, a crate of spiced flatbread that she'd included as an experiment. Colton loaded it onto his wagon with the same efficiency he brought to everything and left before dawn. Eliza spent the day working on the next batch and trying not to count the hours. He came back late that afternoon. He came around to the kitchen door. He'd taken to using the kitchen door, she'd noticed, rather than the front, which was partly practicality and partly something she hadn't named yet, and set a canvas pouch on the table that was noticeably heavier than the one she'd given him for incidentals. "Sold out by noon," he said. She looked at the pouch. Then she looked at him. "They asked if you could do twice the amount next time," he said. "And they want to know if you do anything sweet." Eliza sat down at the kitchen table because her legs had gotten uncertain again, but for an entirely different reason than the last time. "Twice the amount," she repeated. "At minimum," he said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which meant he'd begun to feel comfortable in this kitchen, which meant something. "There are 3 other camps within range. Millhaven Camp, the one up on Sutter's Fork, and there's a new operation starting east of there. If you can supply all 3, that's more than I can produce alone," Eliza said. Her mind was already running numbers. "Your mother bakes," he said. She looked up. "How do you know that?" "You mentioned it, back at Mercer's." She hadn't remembered mentioning it, but she probably had. She'd been laying out the operation and her mother was part of the operation, and she didn't edit herself the way she used to, not with him. "She does," Eliza said. "And Mrs. Orton on the east side of town, she used to run a cookhouse. She's had hard times since her husband passed." "Could be work for her," Colton said, "if the volume supports it." Eliza looked at him. "You're building this out further than I am." "I'm just following the arithmetic," he said. It was, she thought, the most appealing thing a person had said to her in recent memory. She hired Agnes Orton the following week. The woman arrived at the Vance kitchen on a Tuesday morning with her own rolling pin in a flour sack and a no-nonsense air that reminded Eliza of her mother, except that Agnes had the additional quality of finding most situations mildly funny rather than existentially threatening. She looked at the kitchen, looked at the setup Eliza had arranged, and said, "You've thought this through." "I've tried to," Eliza said. "Most people who try to think things through miss something. What did you miss?" Eliza paused. "I don't know yet," she said. "Probably something expensive." Agnes laughed, a real laugh, unpretty and genuine. "I like you," she said. "All right, show me the bread." The operation expanded with a speed that frightened Eliza slightly and energized her considerably. Within 3 weeks, they were supplying 2 camps. Within 5, 3. The income wasn't transformative, not yet, but it was real, and it was steady, and when she sat down with the ranch accounts at the end of the first month and ran the numbers against the debt, she could see for the first time a path that was not purely theoretical. She should have known that visibility was dangerous. The first sign was small. Dunner's Mill sent a message that their next order would be delayed. The regular supplier had apparently encountered difficulties, some problem with the route that Colton was unable to clarify when she asked him. He looked at her with an expression that was careful and level, which she'd come to recognize as his way of saying he had more information than he was giving her but wasn't certain of it yet. "What is it?" she said. "I heard something," he said. "I don't have anything solid." "Tell me what you heard." He set down the coffee she'd poured him. He'd taken disdain for coffee after deliveries, which was a development both of them seemed to be carefully not discussing, and looked at the table for a moment. "Gerald Blackridge has a silent share in the freight route between here and Calvert. The mill relies on that route for their outgoing goods. If Blackridge wanted to make that route difficult for a particular customer, he could delay my supplies without ever putting his name on it," Eliza said. "That's what I heard," Colton said. "I can't prove it." She sat with this for a moment. She had known the Blackridges would notice. She had told herself she was prepared for it. She found, sitting at her kitchen table with Colton Hayes across from her, and the first real income she'd ever earned sitting in an account at the Territorial Bank, that she was less prepared for it than she'd believed. "There are other mills," she said. "Farther out," he said. "More expensive. Adds to your costs." How much more expensive? He told her. She ran the numbers in her head. She could absorb it, barely. But barely was the margin she'd been living on her whole life, and barely didn't leave room for error. The other thing I heard, Colton said, is that there's talk in town about the bakery, about where your money comes from. People are saying you're... He paused, choosing the word with care. Operating something improper out here. Eliza stared at him. Improper. That's the word being used. I sell bread to mining camps, she said, and she heard how flat her own voice sounded. I sell bread. That's what I do. I know that, Colton said. I'm telling you what's being said. By who? Who do you think? She thought. She knew. She didn't need it confirmed. The rumors were not the weapon. The rumors were the signal that a weapon was being prepared. Eliza had grown up in Red Hollow, and she understood how the territory worked. When a powerful family decided to destroy something, they didn't do it directly. They created a climate. They made the air around their target thin and difficult to breathe. They murmured at the right people, applied pressure at the right points, and waited for the target to collapse under conditions that could never be directly attributed to them. She had walked into this with her eyes open, or she'd told herself she had. The second sign was her mother. Ruth Vance had come a long way from the woman who had stood in this kitchen telling Eliza she needed to go apologize to Caleb Blackridge. She had put her hands in the flour and worked the early mornings without complaint, and asked sharp, useful questions about quantities and margins, and she had, in her own controlled and unexpressive way, become invested in what they were building. Eliza had watched this happen and been careful not to comment on it because commenting on it would require her mother to either acknowledge it or retreat from it, and she wasn't sure which would happen. But Ruth came to her one evening after Agnes had gone home, and her father was in the barn and said, Mrs. Caldwell told me today that Margaret Fenner told her that the women at the church meeting last Sunday were saying, Mama, Eliza said, that you have lost your moral character and that Caleb Blackridge was well out of the arrangement. Eliza looked at her mother. Ruth's face was set in the tight, controlled way that meant she was angry and was managing it, which was the only way Ruth Vance knew how to be angry. What did you say to Mrs. Caldwell? Eliza asked. I told her that my daughter was a businesswoman who supplied food to working men and that anyone suggesting otherwise had too much time on their hands. Ruth paused. I said it in front of 3 other women. Eliza set down what she was holding. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, her mother agreed. I didn't. She picked up a cloth and began wiping down the counter, which was already clean. Your Agnes Orton has a sister in Mill Haven who bakes. Did you know that? The pivot was so abrupt it took Eliza a second. No, she said. Agnes mentioned it. Her sister's fallen on hard times. She thought perhaps... I'll talk to Agnes, Eliza said. Her mother nodded and kept wiping the counter. Eliza watched her and felt something shift in the architecture of her chest. Not dramatically, not like a collapse, but like a wall that had been under pressure for a long time releasing slightly. She did not cry. She was not a crier, and neither was her mother. But she felt it. The third sign came not from whispers, but from Colton, who arrived one morning earlier than expected with a look on his face that he wasn't quite successfully making neutral. What happened? She said, as soon as she saw him. He came inside and sat down and told her. The Ridgeback camp foreman had been approached. She didn't know by whom yet, he said, but someone had spoken to the man in charge of supply decisions at the camp and suggested that continuing to take deliveries from the Vance bakery might create complications for the camp's water rights application, which was pending with the territorial authority. Eliza sat very still. The water rights application was everything to the Ridgeback operation. Without water rights secured, the camp couldn't expand and possibly couldn't survive the coming dry season. A word in the wrong ear at the territorial authority could delay that application for years. The foreman, she said. What did he say? Colton looked at her steadily. He said he'd need to think about it, which meant he was considering pulling the contract. He doesn't know if the threat is real, she said. No, neither do I. But someone is willing to threaten a mining operation's water supply to stop me from selling bread. She heard how it sounded. She wanted him to hear how it sounded too. Colton leaned forward with his forearms on the table. He'd been careful, with her, in a particular way, never telling her what to do, never assuming what she wanted, never putting his own opinion in the room before she'd had time to form hers. She had appreciated that with the part of herself that valued being treated as an equal. There was another part of her tired and frightened and running on 3 months of relentless pressure that occasionally wished he would just tell her what he thought she should do. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked at her. "I think you need a lawyer," he said. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You can't afford not to have one," he said. "What's being done to you, child? The freight delays, the water rights pressure, there may be legal recourse. At minimum, there's documentation. If you start building a record now, of what? Rumors? Implied threats?" "Of a pattern," he said. "A pattern is something a court can look at." She stood up and went to the window because she needed to look at something outside herself for a moment. The yard. The barn. The lean in it that she'd always meant to fix. Her father had been talking about fixing it for 15 years, and she'd added it to the list 6 months ago, and then other things had moved ahead of it, and it was still leaning. "I don't have enough to fight back yet," she said. "I need more time." "You might not get more time," Colton said quietly. "I know that," she said. She turned back around. "I know that. I'm trying to figure out how to make more time." He nodded once. He didn't push. He let the silence hold while she thought. What she was thinking was this. She had started this to survive 60 days. And she had survived them. The bakery was real. The income was real. The debt had stopped growing and started, slowly, being addressed. What she had not fully reckoned with was that survival itself had made her a target. She had thought that if she kept her head down and built something small and solid, the Blackridges might simply ignore her. She had underestimated the cost of their pride. Caleb Blackridge had offered to buy her, and she had said no. And a man like Caleb, and a family like the Blackridges, did not forget a no. What they remembered was the affront, and what they required was the correction. If they couldn't have her compliance, they would have her ruin. Those were the only two options they could conceive of. She had known this. She hadn't let herself believe it, not fully. "All right," she said. "A lawyer. You know one?" "In Harlan County," he said. "A man named Beaumont. He's decent, and he's not connected to the Blackridge family, which is harder to find around here than it should be. Can you get him a message?" "I'll go myself, if it's all right. Faster." She looked at him. He was offering to take a day out of his own work to ride to Harlan County on her behalf. "Colton," she said. "Don't," he said. "Not unkind, just preemptive. It's a practical decision. I do business in Harlan County anyway. I can talk to Beaumont while I'm there." She recognized the arithmetic. She let him offer it. "Thank you," she said, because this time she was not going to brush it off. He left the next morning before she was up. She found, in the hour after he'd gone, that the kitchen felt larger than it usually did, which was an observation she filed away without examining. The foreman at Ridgeback sent a message 2 days later. He'd thought about it. He was keeping the contract. He didn't explain why he'd made that choice, but she could guess. The miners themselves had made their position clear, or the threat had turned out to be less credible than the Blackridge family hoped, or the foreman had simply done the math and decided a guaranteed food supply was worth more than a speculative pressure campaign. She read the message twice and then went and told her mother, who said, "Good," and went back to work. That was the day Agnes Orton's sister arrived from Millhaven. Her name was Dorothy, and she was quieter than Agnes and more precise in her work, and had, Eliza discovered, a gift for pastry that none of the rest of them could match. Within a week she was handling all the sweet orders. The miners had asked repeatedly, and it turned out what they wanted was something that reminded them of home, which was often something sweet made by someone who knew what they were doing. The kitchen had 3 women in it now, most mornings. There was noise and opinion and occasionally sharpness, because 3 women with their own ways of doing things will always have some sharpness. But there was also something else, a quality of seriousness and competence that felt to Eliza like being somewhere she actually belonged. She was still frightened. She was still carrying 60 days of debt pressure and Blackridge pressure and the ever-present awareness that the next attack could come from an angle she hadn't considered yet. The barn still leaned. Her father's back still hurt. Nothing had been resolved cleanly, because nothing on the frontier ever resolved cleanly. But she was not disappearing. She was in fact becoming harder to ignore, which was both the best thing and the most dangerous thing about where she found herself now. Colton came back from Harlan County on a Thursday with a letter from the lawyer Beaumont, who wanted to hear more about what had been happening and who had, in the letter, used the phrase actionable interference in a way that suggested he thought there was something real to work with. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the tin box under her bed where she kept the accounts. Then she went back to the kitchen because there were orders to fill, and time was never free on the frontier. She passed Colton on the way, and he was leaning against the doorframe with his coffee, watching the activity in the kitchen. The three women, the rising dough, the organized movement of people who knew what they were doing, with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're looking at something like you're thinking something." He considered. "I was thinking that 3 months ago you were sitting in a dry field unable to stand up," he said. "And now you have a bakery with 3 employees and a lawyer in Harlan County." She stopped beside him. "I'm still the same person who was sitting in that field," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I was thinking about." She didn't have an answer for that. She went into the kitchen and he stood in the doorway a moment longer, and she did not look back. But she was aware of him there, the way you are aware of a fire in a room. Not burning you, just present, just warm, just changing the quality of the air. She had not solved anything. The Blackridges were not finished. The debt was not resolved. The barn still leaned, and the lawyer in Harlan County was still just a letter in a tin box. But she was standing in her own kitchen, building something that was hers, surrounded by women who had shown up for the same reason she had, because they had been given nothing and decided to make something anyway. That was not small. She had spent too long being told it was small. It was not small at all. The lawyer's letter sat in the tin box for 11 days before Beaumont himself rode into Red Hollow. Eliza hadn't expected him in person. She'd expected correspondence, a series of carefully worded letters moving slowly between her kitchen table in Harlan County while the situation either stabilized or worsened. Instead, she came around the side of the house one morning to find a compact, gray-haired man tying his horse to the fence post with the methodical patience of someone who had ridden a long way and intended to make the trip worth it. He had a leather case under one arm and the particular expression of a man who had seen a great many difficult situations and found most of them, on close inspection, to be versions of things he'd seen before. "Miss Vance," he said when he saw her. Not a question. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "Your friend Hayes wrote me a longer letter than the first one," he said. "I thought it would be better to come." She looked at him. "What did he tell you?" "Enough," Beaumont said. "Can we sit somewhere?" They sat at the kitchen table. Agnes was there, working, and Beaumont glanced at her once and then gave her no more attention, which Agnes seemed to appreciate. Ruth brought coffee without being asked, set it down, and positioned herself at the counter where she could hear everything without appearing to be listening. Eliza had long ago stopped finding her mother's methods surprising. Beaumont opened his leather case and laid 3 sheets of paper on the table in a precise row, as though their arrangement mattered. "I've been looking into the Blackridge family's holdings," he said, "specifically as they relate to freight routes, mill contracts, and territorial water rights applications in this district." He touched the first sheet. "They have more involvement in the infrastructure of this territory than most people realize. Gerald Blackridge has a habit of acquiring small controlling interests in things. Not large enough to be conspicuous, but large enough to apply pressure when he wants to." "I know," Eliza said. "What you may not know," Beaumont said, "is that 2 of those interests may be operating outside the terms of their original territorial charters. The freight route he holds a share in, the one causing your supply delays, was chartered for agricultural goods only. Using it to exert commercial pressure on an unrelated business could be construed as a misuse of that charter." Eliza looked at the paper. "Could be construed," she said. "Lawyers say could be," Beaumont said, without apology. "That's the nature of the work. But the argument exists, and if you have documentation of the delays, the timing, the correspondence, I have all of it," she said. He looked at her for the first time with what might have been approval. "Good," he said. She went to the bedroom and came back with the tin box. Inside it was every record she'd kept since the beginning. Order dates, delivery dates, the gaps between them, the excuses offered by the mill's freight coordinator, the price adjustments that had appeared without explanation. She had not kept these records because she'd anticipated a legal dispute. She'd kept them because she kept records of everything. It was the habit of someone who had grown up watching what happened when numbers went untracked. Beaumont spent an hour with the papers. He made notes. He asked questions with the brisk efficiency of a man who didn't waste other people's time because he didn't waste his own. When he finished, he squared the papers up and looked at her across the table. "This is a start," he said. "Not a guarantee. I want to be clear about that. The Blackridge family has resources and connections I'd be foolish to underestimate. But what you have here is a pattern, and a pattern is something I can work with." "What do you need from me?" Eliza said. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," he said. "Keep records. Don't do anything that gives them legitimate grounds to come after you. And if anything changes, any new pressure, any new interference, you contact me immediately." He stood, gathered his papers, clicked his case shut. "One more thing," he said at the door. "I've seen cases like this before, not identical, but similar. A small operator doing something that threatens a large established interest. The large interest rarely attacks directly at first. They chip away. They make things difficult, expensive, tiring. They wait for you to make a mistake or run out of energy." He looked at her directly. "Don't run out of energy." "I'll do my best," she said. "Do better than your best," he said, and left. Agnes appeared at her elbow with coffee she hadn't asked for. "I like him," Agnes said. "He didn't say a single kind thing," Eliza said. "No," Agnes agreed, "but he meant every word, which is rarer." The week after Beaumont's visit was quiet in the way that Eliza had learned to distrust. Not peaceful, but waiting. The freight delays eased slightly, which might have meant the pressure had backed off, or might have meant it was being redirected. The camp sent their orders in, and she filled them. Dorothy had developed a dried fruit cake that was becoming something the miners asked for specifically, and she'd figured out how to pack it so it survived an 18-mile wagon ride without crumbling, which was its own kind of engineering. The bakery, she had started thinking of it as the bakery, not the kitchen operation or the bread arrangement, was real in a way that still occasionally surprised her. She had 3 employees, a lawyer on retainer in Harlan County, a supply chain she'd built from nothing, and contracts with 4 mining camps. She had a tin box full of documentation and a growing account at the Territorial Bank, and a mother who showed up before dawn and didn't complain about it. What she did not have was security, and she was clear-eyed enough not to pretend otherwise. Colton came by on a Friday, which was not a delivery day. She noticed the irregularity before he'd dismounted. He came around to the kitchen door the way he always did, but he stood in the doorway instead of coming in, which meant he had something to say that he was working out how to say. "There's a problem," she said. "There might be," he said. He came in, sat down. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and waited, because she'd learned that with Colton, waiting was always more productive than prompting. "I was in town this morning," he said. "I heard something at the feed store. Someone's been talking to the owners of the Millhaven camp and the Sutter's Fork operation." He looked at her steadily. "Not about water rights this time. About the quality of your product." Eliza went still. "What about it?" "They're saying you've been using spoiled flour, that the bread-making men sick up at Ridgeback." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. "That's not true," Eliza said. "I know it's not true," he said. "No one at Ridgeback has complained." "I know," he said. "Then where is this coming from?" He looked at her with the level expression that meant he'd already worked out the answer and was giving her the space to reach it herself. She reached it. "They don't need it to be true," she said. "They just need the camp owners to be uncertain enough to reconsider the contracts." "That's my read," he said. She stood up and went to the window. The yard. The barn. The fence that needed new posts on the south side. A rumor about food quality in a territory where the alternative was salt pork and hardtack was not a small thing. The mining camps depended on healthy workers. A foreman who believed, even halfway believed, that his men might be getting sick from the bread he'd contracted for would have to act on that belief. It didn't matter that it was false. Doubt was enough. "Beaumont," she said. "I sent a message this morning," Colton said, "before I came here." She turned around. "You sent it before you told me?" "I sent it because it would take 2 days to reach him and every hour matters," he said. "I'm telling you now because you needed to know now." She looked at him. The logic was clean and she couldn't argue with it, but something in her needed a moment to accept that someone had acted on her behalf without waiting for her direction. She'd spent a long time being the only person who acted on her behalf. "All right," she said. "What else?" The Ridgeback foreman will want to hear from you directly, he said. Not a letter. In person. He's a practical man. He'll want to look you in the face. Can you take me out there? Tomorrow morning, he said. She nodded. Then, how long do you think we have before this reaches the other camps? A week, he said. Maybe less. A week. She ran the numbers. Not money this time, but time and movement, and what could be done in 7 days against a campaign that had resources she didn't have, and no particular ethical constraint on how it deployed them. I need to write to each foreman tonight, she said, before they hear it secondhand. I'll want to offer them access to our records, ingredient sources, dates, quantities, everything documented. That's good, Colton said. Agnes, Eliza said, without raising her voice much. Agnes appeared from the back room with the particular promptness of someone who had been listening from a careful distance. I need you to stay tonight. I need Dorothy too, if she can. I'll send for her, Agnes said, without asking why. This was what the bakery had become. 3 women who showed up when it mattered because they'd built something together and it was theirs to protect too. Eliza had not planned for that. She'd planned for bread and supply chains and freight costs. The rest had accumulated the way good things sometimes accumulate without announcement. They wrote the letters that night, Eliza drafting, Agnes and Dorothy suggesting, Ruth sitting at the table correcting Eliza's spelling with a pencil and pretending she was doing something else. 4 letters went out before midnight, each one direct, each one offering documentation, each one asking for the chance to address concerns in person before any decisions were made. The trip to Ridgeback took most of the following morning. The road past the third creek was as rough as Colton had described it the very first time they discussed this arrangement, which felt a long time ago now, though it wasn't. They didn't talk much on the road, but the silence was the old kind, the comfortable kind, the kind that had become its own form of conversation over months of shared work and shared problem-solving. The Ridgeback foreman was a broad, sunburned man named Carroll, who met them in front of the main supply building with an expression that was not hostile but was not warm. He shook Colton's hand. He looked at Eliza with the careful assessment of a man deciding something. "Miss Vance?" he said. "Mr. Carroll," she said. She had her records with her in a leather folder she'd borrowed from Beaumont when he came. "I think you've heard some things. I'd like to show you where my flour comes from, when it comes, and what I do with it." Carroll looked at the folder. "You got all that in there?" "Every delivery since I started," she said, "dated and signed. I can show you the quality inspection I do on every batch. I can show you the source receipts from Dunner's Mill in Calvert." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the door of the building. "You better come in then," he said. She spent an hour at a rough wooden table with Carroll and his second-in-command, laying out the records page by page. Carroll was not an educated man in any formal sense, but he was sharp, and he knew how to read what mattered. He asked good questions about the flour inspection process, about how she handled a bad batch if one came, about how long goods could sit before quality dropped. She answered everything directly. She did not soften or hedge or try to manage his impression of her. She simply told him what was true. At the end of it, Carroll leaned back in his chair and looked at the papers spread across the table. "My men haven't been sick," he said. "No," Eliza said, "they haven't. And the story I heard came from a man in town I'd normally buy a horse from without looking at its teeth twice." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I probably should have looked at the teeth." "You're looking now," she said. He grunted. It might have been a laugh. "I'm keeping the contract," he said, "but I want you to know, if I hear anything concrete, anything I can actually check against your records and it doesn't add up, I'll have to act on that." "That's fair," she said. "That's all I'm asking for." They shook hands across the table. Carroll's handshake was the kind that didn't distinguish between who you were and whether you were worth taking seriously. She appreciated that more than she would have been able to explain. Colton was waiting outside with the horses. He raised an eyebrow. "He's keeping it," she said. He exhaled. Not dramatically, just the breath of someone releasing something they'd been holding. "Good." They started back. The road was no smoother heading west than it had been heading east, which was the consistent nature of bad roads. "Colton," she said after a while. When this is over, when whatever the Black Ridges are planning has played out, I want to expand the route. Farther east. There are camps I haven't reached yet. He was quiet for a moment. That would require more freight capacity than I can offer alone, he said. I know, she said. I've been thinking about a second wagon, potentially a hired driver. Another pause. She'd learned to let his pauses run their full length. That's a significant outlay, he said. I know that too. You'd need to be sure the current revenue was stable before you committed to that. Yes, she said. I'm not proposing to do it next week. I'm proposing to think about it. That seems reasonable, he said. She glanced at him. He was looking at the road ahead, but something in the set of his jaw was different. Not tighter, softer, thoughtful. I'm not going to stop, she said. Not as a declaration, just as a fact she was stating. I know, he said. I've been aware of that since approximately the second time I met you. When they got back, there were two things waiting. A message from the Millhaven camp foreman saying he'd received her letter and would like to discuss the matter, and a broken window in the side of the bakery building. The window was not an accident. A rock had been thrown through it. She could see the rock on the floor inside, among the shattered glass. Nothing had been damaged beyond the window itself, but the message was clear enough without a note attached. She stood at the broken window and looked at the rock and did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She did not feel afraid, more useful than fear. The particular clarity of a person who has just seen something confirmed. They knew she wasn't stopping, and they had decided that if pressure on her suppliers and pressure on her customers wasn't enough, they would try something more direct. We document this, she said. Already, Colton said. He had a small notebook out. He was writing down the time, the date, the description of the damage with the methodical care of a man who understood, without needing to be told twice, that records were the weapon she was building. Agnes came out of this bakery with her arms crossed. She looked at the window. She looked at the rock. She looked at Eliza. Well, Agnes said, that's cowardly. It is, Eliza said. Are you going to tell Beaumont? I'm going to write him tonight. Agnes nodded. She went back inside and came back with a broom and began sweeping the glass without further comment, because there was glass to sweep and the bread still needed to be made, and those two facts existed simultaneously, and both of them required attention. Dorothy's sister was a woman named Harriet, who arrived from the Millhaven camp 2 days later with a message from the foreman there. He had read Eliza's letter and looked at the situation and decided that a rumor without evidence was not grounds to break a contract that was working. He would keep the arrangement. The message was written in the particular blunt language of a man who had not been educated for elegance but had been educated by work, and Eliza found it more reassuring than anything more polished could have been. That made 3 camps holding. The fourth, Sutter's Fork, went quiet in a way she didn't like. The foreman there had not responded to her letter. When she sent a follow-up through Harriet, who knew someone at the camp, she got back word that the foreman was thinking on it, which was not the same as no, but was not the same as yes either. She let it sit. Pushing him would look like desperation. She sent the regular order to Sutter's Fork on the regular schedule, as though the arrangement were unchanged, and waited. The waiting cost her sleep. She lay in the dark again the way she had in those first terrible months after the Blackridge meeting, but this time it was different. She wasn't lying awake dissolving. She was lying awake planning, which was exhausting in its own way, but was an exhaustion that belonged to her. Beaumont wrote back about the window. His letter was short. He told her to file a report with the territorial marshal in Red Hollow. She knew the territorial marshal slightly, a man named Gideon Park, who was conscientious and overworked, and not particularly aligned with any of the major families, which in Red Hollow counted for a great deal. She went to see him the morning after Beaumont's letter arrived. Park listened to her with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes on her face. He was maybe 50, with the kind of face that had permanently settled into seriousness the way some faces do. You're saying it was deliberate, he said. I'm saying a rock was thrown through my window, she said. I have no proof of who threw it. I'm filing a report, so there's a record that it happened. Park looked at her for a moment. You know who I think did it? I have a theory, she said. Theories aren't evidence. No, he said. They're not. He picked up a pen. Tell me the details. She told him. He wrote it down. When she got up to leave, he said, Miss Vance, I'm going to tell you something that is not strictly part of my official capacity. She waited. Gerald Blackridge made a visit to this office 6 weeks ago, Park said. He suggested that I might want to look into your operation, implied there might be something irregular about it. He looked at her with the flat, careful gaze of a man who had thought about something and reached a conclusion. I looked. There wasn't. I'm telling you this because you should know what's being said and by whom, and because I think you're entitled to that information. She stood in the doorway of his office and let this settle. Thank you, she said. File a report if anything else happens, he said, and went back to his paperwork. She walked out of the marshal's office into the bright, dusty air of Red Hollow's main street and stood for a moment on the boardwalk. The town moved around her the way it always had. Wagons, horses, the general purposeful noise of a place conducting its daily business. People who passed her met her eyes, or didn't, nodded or looked away, their feelings about her written in small legible gestures. She was still the woman who had refused Caleb Blackridge. That fact had not changed and would not change. But it was beginning, very slowly, unevenly, in ways she wasn't sure she fully trusted yet, to mean something different to different people. A few of the women she passed nodded at her with something that wasn't hostility. The man who ran the hardware store, who had not spoken to her directly since the story got out, said morning as she passed his door. Small things. The frontier equivalent of a weather change. Not dramatic, just a slight shift in the pressure. She knew better than to count on it. Social sympathy was a thin thing, and it moved with the wind, and the Blackridges still had more influence in this town than she did. But she noted it. The Sutter's Fork foreman sent word on a Wednesday. He was keeping the arrangement. He didn't give a reason. She suspected that word had reached him from the other foremen, who talked to each other the way people in the same business always do, and that the consensus from the men he trusted had pointed toward keeping a contract that was working. All 4 camps were holding. She told Colton that evening. He received the news with the careful restraint of a man who didn't want to celebrate something before it had finished proving itself, which was the right instinct. But he did allow himself one thing. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Direct and uncomplicated in a way that made her want to look away, and she didn't. You did that, he said. Ridgeback, the letters, Carol, all of it. We did it, she said. Some of it, he said. Not most of it. She considered disputing this and decided it wasn't worth disputing. She accepted it instead, which was its own kind of progress for a woman who had spent her life deflecting anything that looked like acknowledgement. What she didn't say, couldn't yet say, not with the shape things were in, was that she was aware of him in a way that had grown past practical and professional and into something she didn't have clean territory-approved language for. It was not the sweeping kind of feeling that people described in the sentimental stories her mother sometimes borrowed from the lending library. It was quieter than that and more insistent. The specific awareness of a person whose presence changed the quality of a room. The particular relief of a mind that could stop calculating for a moment, because someone else it trusted was also calculating. She did not examine this too closely. There was too much else to examine, and the wrong moment to say a true thing was just as bad as not saying it. What happened 2 weeks later was the wrong moment for several things. She was at the bakery before dawn. This was routine by now, the pre-dawn dark, the fire in the stove, the smell of bread beginning its slow work. When she heard horses on the road. More than one. At that hour, more than one horse on the road was never ordinary. Agnes came to the back door 2 minutes later with her coat thrown over her nightgown, because Agnes lived close enough to hear horses and had developed, over months of increasing pressure, the particular alertness of someone expecting trouble. "There's a wagon blocking the road north," Agnes said. 3 men. I don't know them." Eliza looked at the stove, at the bread that had 40 minutes left in it, at the morning that was supposed to be ordinary. "Wake my father," she said. Agnes went. Eliza took the lamp and went around the front of the house, and she could see the wagon from the road. It was drawn sideways across the track north, the one the delivery wagon used to reach the camps. 2 of the men were on horses beside it. The third was standing in the road. He was not anyone she recognized. She stood in her yard and looked at him across the dark distance between them and understood several things simultaneously. This was not random, it was intended, and the intent was not to harm her physically, but to show her something, to demonstrate capacity, to let her stand in the dark and feel the weight of what could be deployed against her. She stood in the dark and felt it. Then she went back inside and picked up her pen and wrote 4 sentences to Beaumont, describing the time, the location, the number of men, the wagon. Her father came out fully dressed, which meant he'd been awake already. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the road for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at her father, 53 years old, bad back, face that had been carrying grief for months, and had lately, slowly, been setting it down. He was asking her, not directing her, not managing her, asking her. "We wait them out," she said. "We document everything, and we don't give them anything they can use." Thomas Vance looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the look of a man who has revised his understanding of something and is trying to be honest about the revision. "All right," he said. "I'll make coffee." The wagon was gone before sunrise, the men with it. The road was open when the delivery wagon came at its usual hour, driven by Colton, who arrived looking at the road and then at Eliza with a question he didn't need to ask. "They were here," she said. "I saw tracks," he said. He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when she said she was all right. Not doubting it exactly, but measuring it, applying the particular attention of someone who had been paying close enough attention to know the difference between she was all right and she was managing. "The bread's ready," she said. He loaded the wagon. She handed up the crates with Agnes and Dorothy, and they worked in the early light the way they always worked, with the efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the task had become its own kind of language. When the wagon was loaded and Colton was up on the seat, he looked down at her and said quietly, "They're going to escalate." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" She thought about the tin box under her bed, the lawyer in Harlan County, the marshal who had told her things that weren't strictly in his official capacity, the 4 camps holding, her mother at the counter before dawn, her father making coffee at a window at 3 in the morning, asking her what she wanted to do. "I'm not ready," she said, "but I'm not stopping." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she didn't try to name because it wasn't the time. Then he clicked to the horses and the wagon moved, and she stood in the road and watched it go, and turned back toward the bakery where Agnes was already pulling the second batch from the stove. Because there was always a second batch, and the work was always waiting, and the work was the point, the work was the proof, the work was the thing they could not take from her no matter what they drove down her road in the middle of the night. She went inside. She got back to it. Beaumont's reply to her 3 in the morning letter arrived 4 days later, and it was the shortest thing he had ever written her. "Document everything. Don't move first, they will." She pinned it to the wall above the work table where she could see it while she worked, which Agnes said was either practical or unsettling depending on how you looked at it. Eliza said it was both, and left it there. The escalation when it came did not announce itself. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed for the territory, who tied their horses at the front of the house and knocked at the front door instead of the kitchen door, which told her immediately they were not people who came on ordinary business. Her father answered before she could get there. By the time she reached the front room, both men were inside and one of them was producing a folded document from his coat pocket, with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected the document to end the conversation. "Miss Eliza Vance," the taller one said. "Yes," she said. "We represent the Office of the Territorial Land Authority." He held out the document. "This is a notice of formal inquiry into the commercial operation being conducted on this property. It's been brought to the authorities' attention that you may be operating a commercial food production business on land that is designated agricultural residential under its current deed classification. Commercial operations require a separate permit, which records indicate you do not hold." Eliza took the document. She read it. She read it again. The permit requirement was real. She knew it was real because she had looked into it when she first started the bakery, and what she had determined at that time was that the scale of her operation, home-based, supplying goods under a certain threshold, fell under an exemption in the territorial code that did not require the commercial permit. She had written this down. She had the page of the territorial code where she'd found it, annotated in her own hand, in the tin box under her bed. "I believe my operation falls under the small-scale producer exemption in Section 14 of the Territorial Commerce Code," she said. The taller man's expression didn't change. "That exemption has a volume threshold," he said. "We have received information suggesting your current output exceeds that threshold." "What information?" she said. "The inquiry will establish the facts," he said. with the smoothness of someone who had delivered versions of this speech many times. In the meantime, you are required to suspend commercial operations pending review. Her father made a sound that was not quite a word. Eliza put a hand up, not to silence him, but to indicate she had this, and he stopped. "How long is the review?" she said. "These things can take several weeks, sometimes longer, depending on caseload." Weeks. She did the arithmetic instantly. Several weeks of suspended operations meant 4 camp contracts going unfilled, which meant the camps would find other suppliers, which meant when the review concluded, however it concluded, she would be starting over from nothing on the customer side. It was elegant in the way that truly destructive ideas are sometimes elegant. No violence, no broken windows, nothing the marshal could write a report about. Just paperwork and time and the patient application of bureaucratic process as a weapon. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," she said. "You're welcome to come to the authority office in Harlan." "I'm not going to Harlan. I'm going to write to them today, and I'm going to include the section of the territorial code that I believe applies to my situation, and I'm going to request that the review be conducted as a correspondence matter rather than requiring suspension of operations during the inquiry period." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who was frightened and not showing it. "That is within my rights under the inquiry protocol, as I understand it." The taller man looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected, she thought, to hand her the paper and have her fold. "You may submit correspondence," he said. "The authority will determine whether operations can continue during review." "Thank you," she said. "I'll see you out." They left. Her father closed the door behind them and stood there with his hand on the doorframe and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Was that true? About the exemption?" "Yes," she said. "I checked it before I started. I have the documentation." "You knew they might do something like this." She went to the tin box. "I didn't know specifically, but I knew they would find something official to use. Official is cleaner for them than rocks through windows." She sat at the table and began writing. The letter to the territorial authority took her 3 drafts in 2 hours, because every word mattered, and she knew it. She cited the code section. She attached the page she'd annotated months ago. She described the volume of her operation with precise numbers that demonstrated she remained within the exemption threshold, numbers she had kept because she kept numbers for everything, and which now turned out to be among the most important records she possessed. She requested continuation of operations during review. She was formal and specific and gave them nothing that was not fact. Colton arrived in the middle of the second draft. She told him what had happened without stopping writing. He read over her shoulder in silence for a moment, then sat down and waited. When she finished, he said, "Send a copy to Beaumont." "I'm making 2 copies," she said. "One to the authority, one to Beaumont, one for the tin box." He was quiet. Then, "The volume threshold in the exemption. Are you actually under it?" She looked up. "Yes, currently. If I'd expanded the way I was thinking about, I'd be over it within 6 months. But right now, today, on the numbers I have, yes." "Then they're working on bad information," he said. "Or invented information," she said. "Someone told the authority my volume exceeded the threshold. Someone who either doesn't know the actual numbers or doesn't care whether they're accurate." Colton said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the table with the expression he got when he was putting pieces together. "They're not trying to win the legal argument," he said. "They're trying to force you to spend time fighting it instead of working." "I know," she said. "What do you need?" She sealed the letter. "I need someone to ride this to the post today, and I need Agnes to know what's happening before she hears it from someone else." He took the letter. He didn't say anything about the fact that she hadn't suggested he write it. She had just handed it to him, and he had taken it, as though the division of what needed doing between them had become its own kind of fluency. Agnes took the news the way Agnes took most things, with a brief silence followed by a practical question. "How long before you know if they'll let you keep operating?" "I don't know," Eliza said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Can you keep filling the orders?" "I'm going to try," Eliza said. "If I stop without being legally required to, I lose the camps anyway. If I keep going and the authority rules against continuation, I'll deal with that when it happens." Agnes nodded. "Dorothy's sister knows how to drive a wagon," she said. "Just so you know, if we need to move product faster." The 2 weeks that followed were the kind that leave a mark not because of what happened, but because of the sustained weight of not knowing. She filled the orders. She sent the documentation to the authority. She waited. The bread rose and was baked and loaded and delivered, and the money came in, and she paid her employees and documented every transaction with the thoroughness of someone building a wall one stone at a time. Beaumont wrote back. He had sent his own letter to the territorial authority with a more formal legal citation of the exemption and a pointed reference to the fact that the inquiry had been triggered by third-party complaint rather than the authority's own audit, which he considered relevant to the question of whether operations should be suspended during review. His letter was 3 pages. She read it 4 times. Marshall Park came to see her on a Thursday without being summoned, which she took as a sign. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He wouldn't come in, just stood with his hat in his hands in almost exact unconscious mirror of her father at the Blackridge meeting, which she noticed and said nothing about, and told her that he had heard the land authority matter was Gerald Blackridge's doing, specifically that Gerald had submitted the complaint himself through an intermediary to avoid having his name on it. "Can you prove that?" she said. "No," Park said, "but I know the man he used, and the man he used has done similar work for the Blackridge family before." She looked at him. "What are you telling me, Marshall?" Park turned his hat in his hands. "I'm telling you," he said carefully, "that if Beaumont wanted to ask certain questions of the authority about the origin of the complaint and the identity of the complainant, there is a process by which that information can be formally requested. The authority is required to disclose it." He looked at her directly. "That's public information. I'm just not sure anyone's told you that." "I'll tell Beaumont," she said. "You do that," Park said, and put his hat back on and left. She sent a rider to Harlan County that afternoon. The authority's response to her letter came at the end of the 2nd week. It was shorter than she'd expected and better than she'd feared. Operations could continue during review pending final determination. The review itself would be completed within 30 days. She read the letter standing at the work table and felt something release in her back that had been locked for 14 days. Agnes was watching her. "Well?" "We keep going," Eliza said. Agnes turned back to the stove without a word, but she was smiling, and the smile had the quality of someone who had been expecting this but hadn't wanted to say so. The 30 days of review were not quiet. They were just a different kind of loud. The second thing the Blackridges tried was smaller and in some ways more personal. Caleb, not his father this time, took to appearing in Red Hollow at moments when Eliza was likely to be in town, at Mercer's, at the post office, on the street. He never spoke to her directly. He simply appeared with 1 or 2 associates and made sure she knew she'd been seen. He was there when she picked up mail. He was at the far end of the street when she left the marshal's office. He was at the feed store on the morning she went to settle an account. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. It was meant to cost her something in the looking, to make her feel watched, followed, assessed. She ignored it with a thoroughness that cost her more than she let on. The third thing was Ruth. Her mother came home from a visit to Mrs. Caldwell's with a face that was composed in the very specific way it got composed when something had shaken her and she was managing it. Eliza saw the face when Ruth came through the kitchen door and set down her basket and took a moment longer than necessary to hang up her coat. "What happened?" Eliza said. Ruth turned around. "Mrs. Caldwell told me that she'd heard from Miriam Hartley that there is a petition circulating among the businessmen of the town." She stopped. "A petition for what?" Eliza said. "To have the territorial authority classify your operation as a commercial enterprise regardless of volume." Ruth's voice was controlled. Precisely controlled, the way it got when she was holding something down. "On the grounds that it constitutes unfair competition with established Red Hollow merchants. They're arguing that because you supply camps outside the town, you're drawing business that would otherwise benefit local suppliers." Eliza sat down. "That's not how the exemption works," she said. "I know that," her mother said. "I don't think they care how it works. I think they want enough signatures to present to the authority as evidence of community concern." "How many signatures?" She didn't know. Eliza was quiet for a moment. The petition was a different kind of attack than the others. Not legal exactly, not physical, but social. It was an attempt to turn the town against her commercially, to make her a problem that the authority needed to solve on behalf of the community rather than an individual operator they were reviewing in isolation. "Who's circulating it?" she said. She didn't say, but she said Gerald Blackridge's name came up in the conversation. Of course it did. Eliza stood up. She went to the window. She looked at the barn. The lean was actually worse, she'd noticed lately, the east wall giving a little more to gravity every month. She'd added it to the list again and moved it higher. There are people in this town who don't like the Blackridges, she said. There are, Ruth said carefully. People who have their own grievances with how Gerald Blackridge has operated. The freight rates, the mill prices, the way he called in loans during the bad years. She turned around. If someone were to suggest that this petition is less about fair competition and more about Gerald Blackridge protecting his family's commercial dominance, that someone would need to say it to the right people, Ruth said. They looked at each other. You know people, Mama, Eliza said. Ruth Vance was quiet for a long moment. She was a woman who had built her sense of self around social navigation, around knowing who mattered and how to speak to them and what they wanted to hear. She had used those skills her whole life to manage appearances and maintain position, and Eliza had sometimes resented those skills as a kind of dishonesty, a way of performing something rather than being it. But standing in the kitchen with the afternoon light on her mother's face, Eliza saw it differently. Those skills were real. They were hard-won and practically useful, and her mother had them in abundance. I'll speak to some people, Ruth said, quietly. Thank you, Eliza said. Her mother picked up an apron. Don't thank me yet, she said. I might make it worse. She didn't make it worse. Over the following week, Ruth Vance spoke to people the way she'd always spoken to people. Over tea, over lending library exchanges, in the brief social encounters that Red Hollow offered to women of a certain standing. She didn't make speeches. She didn't argue. She simply asked questions in the presence of the right people. Questions like whether anyone had noticed that Gerald Blackridge's grain mill had raised its prices twice in the past year. Whether people remembered the loans called in during the dry season of 1882 and who had benefited when the foreclosed properties came up for sale. Whether it seemed curious to anyone else that the same family now concerned about fair competition had spent 20 years arranging things so that fair competition was very difficult to achieve. She planted these questions the way a careful gardener plants things, in the right soil, at the right time, without standing over them. Colton found out about the petition through a contact of his in Harlan County, who sat on a minor territorial advisory board. He came to her on a Saturday morning with this information and the additional information that Beaumont had already heard about it, and was drafting a response to preemptively address its legal weight. He thinks it won't hold, Colton said. The petition, as a legal matter. Legal isn't the only matter, Eliza said. No, he said, but it's the one they're using. She looked at him. They were at the work table, the usual early morning light, the smell of bread in the air. He had a coffee she'd poured him and had not yet touched. He was looking at her with the careful, direct attention she had come to rely on, without quite naming it as reliance. How are you, he said, quiet, specific. She opened her mouth to say she was fine, which was what she said. Then she closed it. I'm tired, she said. Not finished, but tired. He nodded. He let that sit for a moment. Then, they're going to lose this, he said. I want you to know that I believe that. Why? Because they're not fighting to build something, he said. They're fighting to stop something. Those are different kinds of fighting. The first one has a reason to keep going. The second one runs out of steam when the thing they're trying to stop doesn't stop. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the most I've ever heard you say at once, she said. Something moved in his face that was close to a smile. Don't tell anyone, he said. She felt something, a warmth she didn't examine, a loosening in the tiredness that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. She did not say anything about it. There was still too much in the way. The formal response from the authority came on a Wednesday, 31 days after the review had begun. The letter was 2 pages, and it was technical in the way that official documents are technical, hedged, precise, referring to specific code sections. But the substance of it was plain. Her operation fell within the small-scale producer exemption as defined in the Territorial Commerce Code. The volume figures she had provided were consistent with exemption qualification. The inquiry was closed. No commercial permit was required at current operating levels. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because the third time was when it became real. Agnes was not there that morning. Dorothy was, and she read the letter over Eliza's shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a word, somewhere between relief and something fiercer. Eliza sent a rider to Harlan County immediately. Then she sent word to Agnes. Then she went to find her parents. Her father was in the barn, which he'd taken to spending time in lately, working on small repairs with the methodical care of a man who needed to feel useful and had things he was making right. The lean in the east wall was less pronounced than it had been last month. She noticed that. She showed him the letter. He read it slowly. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she would remember. Not celebration, not vindication, but something quieter and more honest than either of those. He looked at her like he was seeing something clearly that he'd been squinting at for a long time. "Eliza," he said. "It's all right, Papa," she said. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "No," he said, "it's not all right. What I did, arranging that meeting without asking you, putting you in that position, that wasn't all right. And this," he gestured, a general gesture that somehow encompassed the bakery and the camps and the past several months. "This is not a thing I did. This is a thing you did, and I should say that plainly." She stood in the barn and felt the weight of what he was offering. Not a grand apology, not a scene, just a man saying a true thing clearly. Her father had never been good at grand gestures. He was good at wooden racks for cooling bread and early morning coffee, and standing at windows at 3 in the morning asking what she wanted to do. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He went back to the wall he was working on. She took the letter inside and put it in the tin box with the others. What came next was not a period of peace. Peace was not what the territory offered, but it was a period of different pressure, lesser pressure, redistributed pressure, the kind that comes when an attack has failed and the attacker has to regroup. The petition never reached the authority. Ruth had spoken to enough people that its circulation stalled and then quietly stopped. Eliza heard about this secondhand through Agnes, who heard it from Harriet, who had a gift for knowing the social weather of 3 towns simultaneously. She didn't ask her mother about it directly. Ruth didn't volunteer it. They both understood that some things were more useful unexamined. Caleb Blackridge stopped appearing on the street. Gerald Blackridge went to the territorial capital for 2 weeks on business that had nothing obviously to do with Eliza, but which Beaumont noted in a letter coincided with a period when his name would have come up in certain formal proceedings related to the freight charter inquiry Beaumont had quietly opened on Eliza's behalf. Beaumont was, she had come to understand, a man who played a longer game than anyone gave him credit for, and who had the particular patience of someone who had learned that the first move in a legal fight is rarely the decisive one. She was at the camp supply depot outside Red Hollow when she saw Caleb Blackridge for the last time in that season. He was coming out as she was going in, a piece of bad geography, unavoidable. He saw her. She saw him. There were perhaps 6 feet of open air between them and no one else immediately nearby. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not contempt. She knew what his contempt looked like. She had absorbed it in her own kitchen on a Sunday morning. This was something different, flatter. The face of a man who had applied significant resources to an outcome and not achieved it, and who was still working out what to do with that. She looked at him with no expression at all, which was the truest thing she had on offer. He walked past her without speaking. She went into the depot and did what she came to do. On the walk home, she let herself feel the full weight of the past months. Not all at once, not dramatically, but as a gradual accounting, the way you feel a physical effort after the effort is over. The debt letters. The kitchen with Caleb and the rock in the road. The field where she'd sat unable to stand up. The water offered without conditions. The flour from Dunner's mill, and the letters to 4 foremen, and the tin box under her bed, and the man who had ridden to Harlan County without being asked, and the mother who had spoken to the right people quietly, and the father rebuilding the barn wall. She had not won. That was not quite the right word for where things stood. She was not safe. The Blackridge family was still the Blackridge family, and Red Hollow was still Red Hollow, and the territory was still a place where a woman building something on her own was treated as a problem to be managed. She had not changed any of those facts. But she was standing. She was still standing, and the thing she had built was still standing, and the people she had built it with were still here. That was not nothing. She had lived long enough in places where nothing was the expectation to know that it was not nothing. Colton was at the ranch when she got back. He'd come to discuss the next delivery schedule, which had expanded now that the situation had stabilized. and she'd been able to think about the expansion she'd mentioned on the road back from Ridgeback months ago. The second wagon was not yet decided, but it was no longer theoretical. He was at the kitchen table with her father, which she noted. The two men had developed the easy company of people who don't talk much in proximity and find this sufficient. Her father was describing the barn wall repair, and Colton was listening with the particular quality of listening he had, which was like being listened to by someone who intended to remember what you said. She came in and sat down and told them both about the encounter at the depot, briefly, without drama. Her father was quiet. Colton looked at her and said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And this time it was clean. No management, no performance. She was all right. "Good," he said. They went over the delivery schedule. The numbers were better than they'd been. Not comfortable. The Frontier did not offer comfortable, and she had stopped expecting it, but real. The debt on the ranch had been reduced by a third. At current rates, it would be eliminated within 14 months. This fact lived in her head in a particular way, like a light left on in a room you were walking toward. When the schedule was settled and her father had gone back to the barn and the light was getting low, Colton gathered his papers and didn't immediately stand up. He looked at the table for a moment with the expression she'd learned to recognize as something arriving that he was taking his time with. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You get a particular look." He glanced up. "Do I?" "Yes," she said. "What have you been thinking about?" He looked at her directly. Colton Hayes was not a man who used words carelessly, and he was not a man who said things before he was sure he meant them, which meant that what he was about to say had been considered carefully and from multiple angles, and he had arrived at it with the deliberateness he brought to everything. "I've been thinking that the arrangement we have, the freight, the supply, the delivery, it works well," he said. "It works because we think the same way about most things, about numbers and what's fair and what's worth doing." He paused. "And I've been thinking that's not something you find easily." She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the early dark of the season was settling over the yard. "No," she said. "It's not." "I'm not good at saying things like this," he said. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." "You're doing fine," she said. Something in his face shifted. The small release of a person who has been holding a thing carefully for a long time and has decided to set it down. "I'd like to keep working with you," he said. "And I'd like it to be something more than work, if that suits you." It was not poetic. It was not the language of romance novels or sentimental songs. It was a man saying a true thing in the plainest words he had, which was exactly how he said everything, and which was, she had come to understand over months of shared arithmetic and shared coffee and shared trouble, the way she most trusted things to be said. "It suits me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, in the way he nodded at fair arrangements. Not understated, just honest. They sat in the kitchen while the dark came in and the bread smell from the day's work still hung in the air, and there was nothing resolved and nothing easy, and the Blackridge family still existed, and the territory was still hard, and the barn wall was still being fixed one board at a time. But the light in the room was warm, and the tin box under her bed was full of documented truth, and the woman who had once sat in a dry field unable to stand up was sitting at her own table, in her own kitchen, in a life she had built with her own hands from material no one had given her. That was what the Frontier looked like when you refused to let it break you. Not triumph, not ease. Just this ordinary miracle of still being here, still building, still standing at the end of a day that had tried, in its various ways, to be the last one. The second wagon arrived on a Thursday in early November, which was not a significant day by any external measure, but which Eliza would remember for the rest of her life with the particular clarity that attaches to moments when something you built with your hands becomes undeniably real. It was not a new wagon. She had not been able to afford a new wagon and had not pretended otherwise. It was a used freight wagon that Colton had located through a contact in Mill Haven, solid construction, one wheel that had been replaced recently with slightly different timber so it didn't quite match the others, a seat that needed a new board on the left side. She had inspected it herself before agreeing to the purchase, going over it with the methodical attention she brought to all decisions that involved money she couldn't afford to waste. She had found 3 things that needed fixing and fixed 2 of them before the wagon made its first run. The third she added to the list. Harriet, Dorothy's sister, the one who could drive a wagon, stood beside it in the yard with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone assessing a horse they've been told is reliable but intend to verify personally. She walked around it once. She tested the brake. She climbed up to the seat and sat there for a moment. "It'll do," she said, which from Harriet was enthusiastic endorsement. Agnes said, "The wheel doesn't match." "The wheel works," Eliza said. "I know," Agnes said. "I'm just noting it." Dorothy handed up the first load of crates and Harriet set off on the eastern route. The longer one, the one that reached the two camps Eliza hadn't been able to supply reliably with a single wagon. Eliza stood in the yard and watched the wagon go and felt Colton beside her, not touching, just present in the particular way he'd become present over the past months. "2 wagons," he said. "2 wagons," she said. "You're going to need a third within a year," he said. She looked at him. "Don't tell my accounts ledger that yet." He almost smiled. "Your accounts ledger already knows," he said. "I've seen how you run the numbers." This was true. She ran the numbers constantly, not anxiously, the way she had in those first months when every figure was a potential catastrophe, but practically, the way a builder watches a structure going up and calculates what comes next. The debt on the ranch was down to a third of what it had been. At current rates, the final payment would be made before the following winter. She had allowed herself to look at that figure directly exactly once, and then put it back in the ledger and kept working, because looking at it too often seemed like the kind of thing that invited the sort of trouble that found people who got comfortable. Beaumont's freight charter case was moving through the territorial authority with the slow patience of legal processes that are not dramatic but are thorough. He had written to her in October with an update that was characteristically spare. The inquiry was proceeding, 2 witnesses had given statements, and Gerald Blackridge had retained additional legal counsel, which Beaumont noted without apparent concern, but which she understood as a signal that the case had reached a point where the Blackridge family was taking it seriously. When powerful families hired additional lawyers, it meant they were worried. When Gerald Blackridge was worried, things tended to happen. She was right about that. The thing that happened came not from Gerald, but from Caleb, which surprised her slightly. She had begun to think of Caleb as finished with her, not reconciled, not neutral, but done, in the way that men who have lost a contest sometimes simply redirect their attention to easier targets. She had been wrong about that. She heard it first from Agnes, who had heard it from Mrs. Caldwell's housekeeper, which was the standard route by which information moved through Red Hollow's social infrastructure. Caleb Blackridge had been speaking to people. Not the foreman, not the legal authorities, not any of the institutional pressure points he'd used before. He had been speaking to individuals, specifically to the families of women who worked for Eliza. He had visited Agnes's brother. He had sent a man to speak to Dorothy's husband, who still lived in Mill Haven. He had, apparently, suggested to these men that their wives and sisters were engaged in something that would eventually bring trouble down on the families associated with it, and that a sensible person might encourage their women to find other employment before that happened. Agnes told Eliza this on a Monday morning while they were both working, and told it without particular drama, which was Agnes's way. Eliza set down what she was holding. "He went to your brother," she said. "Liam told him to mind his own affairs," Agnes said, in language I won't reproduce because Dorothy's present. Dorothy said from across the kitchen, "I've heard worse." "What about Dorothy's husband?" Eliza said. Agnes looked at Dorothy. Dorothy set down the pastry she was working and turned around. "Martin was upset," Dorothy said. She said it plainly, without softening it. "He's not. He worries. He grew up poor and he worries about money the way people do when they didn't have enough of it as children. When the man came and said there might be trouble." "Is Martin going to ask you to stop?" Eliza said. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. "He already did," she said. "Last Wednesday." The kitchen was quiet. "And?" Eliza said. "And I told him that this work was keeping our family ahead of the rent for the first time in 4 years," Dorothy said. "And that if he wanted to have that conversation again, he was welcome to, but he should think about whether he wanted to have it about a different subject." She turned back to the pastry. "He hasn't brought it up again." Eliza stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry he was put in that position. I'm sorry any of you were put in that position." "You didn't put us in it," Agnes said. "Caleb Blackridge did," Dorothy said. "There's a difference." Eliza nodded. But the distinction, however accurate, didn't entirely relieve the weight she felt. The specific weight of knowing that the trouble you'd brought on yourself had reached people who hadn't asked for it, and who had less capacity to absorb it than you did. She wrote to Beaumont that afternoon. She told him about Caleb's visits to the families. She asked whether this constituted a form of interference that could be added to the existing case. Beaumont's reply came 6 days later. It was longer than usual and more precise than usual, which meant he had found something. What he had found was this. The man Caleb had sent to speak to Dorothy's husband in Mill Haven had made statements that went beyond general suggestion. He had implied, specifically, that Eliza's operation was under formal investigation for fraud, a statement that was false, that had no basis in any actual proceeding, and that had been made in a way that could be construed as deliberate misrepresentation intended to cause economic harm. This was different from social pressure. This was different from whisper campaigns and petition drives and freight route interference. This was something Beaumont could use in a way the other things had not yet allowed him to use. He wrote, "I need Dorothy's husband to make a written statement. If he will do that, we have something." Eliza read the letter. She read it again. Then she folded it and went to find Dorothy. She did not tell Dorothy what to do. She told her what Beaumont had found and what he needed and what it might mean, and she said, with the plainness she had learned to apply to difficult things, "I know this puts Martin in a position I don't have any right to put him in. If he won't do it, or if you don't want to ask him, that's a real decision, and I understand it." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. She was working the pastry still, her hands moving with the automatic competence of someone who can think and work simultaneously. "What would the statement do?" she said. "It would give Beaumont grounds to argue that Caleb Blackridge made false statements for the purpose of interfering with my employees' livelihoods," Eliza said. "It would be added to the freight charter case. Together, they might be enough to not destroy the Blackridge family. That's not what this is. But enough to make a formal record of what they've done. Enough to put it in front of a territorial judge and let someone with authority look at the whole picture." "And if Martin won't do it?" "Then we continue without it," Eliza said. "We've continued without a lot of things." Dorothy looked at her. "I'll ask him," she said. "I can't promise you his answer." "I know," Eliza said. "Thank you." Martin came to Red Hollow the following Saturday. He was a slight, quiet man with careful eyes who sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Eliza poured him and looked at everything in the room with the assessment of someone who had been told something about a place and was measuring it against what he'd expected. Dorothy sat beside him. Eliza sat across from them both. She told him what she'd told Dorothy. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The man who came to see me. He said you were being investigated for misrepresenting your business to the territorial authority." "That's not true," Eliza said. "The authority reviewed my operation and closed the inquiry. I have the letter." She put the letter on the table. He read it. "He also said," Martin said, still looking at the letter, "that the women working for you were likely to face consequences when the situation resolved." "That was meant to frighten you," Eliza said. "There are no consequences pending for Dorothy or Agnes or Harriet. There never were." Martin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Dorothy. Something passed between them that Eliza didn't try to read because it was theirs. "What exactly do you need me to say?" he said. She explained. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical. Then he said he'd do it, and she sent for Beaumont's notary form that she'd had the foresight to request in advance, and Martin signed his name to a statement describing what the man had said and when and where, in the particular careful handwriting of someone who had not written formally in a long time and was taking it seriously. When he left, Dorothy stayed to finish the day's work. She didn't say anything about what had happened, neither did Eliza. There are things that don't require narration between people who have been working alongside each other long enough to share a kind of shorthand. Beaumont filed the expanded complaint 2 weeks later. The freight charter case and the misrepresentation claim were presented together, which was the effect Beaumont had been building toward. Not 2 separate incidents, but a pattern, documented and dated and presented with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made it very difficult for the other side to characterize as selective or exaggerated. The territorial court scheduled a hearing for the following February. Gerald Blackridge's additional legal counsel filed 3 motions before Christmas, all of which Beaumont addressed without visible anxiety and which were denied in January. Eliza read each development in Beaumont's letters and added them to the tin box, which was now full enough that she'd had to add a second box, which she kept next to the first under the bed. December was the hardest month, not because of the legal situation, but because the work was hardest in winter. The cold made the dough behave differently. The roads to the camps became unreliable after snow, and Harriet had twice been forced to turn back when the eastern route became impassable. Supply deliveries from Dunner's Mill arrived late twice in December, not because of Blackridge interference, but because of genuine weather, which was a reminder that the territory had its own obstacles entirely independent of human malice. She hired a boy named Teddy Marsh, Clara Marsh's nephew, as it happened, which meant something she didn't examine too closely, to help with loading and unloading. He was 17 and strong and did what he was told without complaint, which were the three things she needed. Agnes took it upon herself to teach him which crates went on the bottom and which on top, a lesson he learned after one incident with a collapsed stack of pastry boxes and did not need to be taught again. Colton came by less frequently in December because his cattle needed more of his time in winter, and she felt his absence in the bakery in a specific way. Not desperate, nothing like the hollow ache of those months when she'd been slowly disappearing. Just the ordinary awareness of a space where a person you'd become accustomed to usually was. She told herself this was reasonable and did not require further examination, and then she thought about it anyway, late at night, in the way you think about things that have become important to you without your quite deciding to let them. He came to the ranch on Christmas Eve. She hadn't expected him. The holiday was not something they'd planned around. And when she heard his horse and looked out and saw him tying up at the fence post, she felt something uncomplicated and warm that she didn't try to name and didn't try to suppress. He brought venison. Her mother, who had not been particularly welcoming to Colton in the early months, in the way that Ruth Vance was not particularly welcoming to things she hadn't initially approved, had by December arrived at a position of composed acceptance that was, by her mother's standards, essentially an embrace. She took the venison from him at the door and said, "You should have come earlier," which was as close to "we wanted you here" as Ruth was constitutionally able to get. They ate together, her parents, Colton, and Eliza, the four of them at the kitchen table with the venison and the bread she'd made and the particular quietness of a winter evening that has earned its rest. Her father talked about the barn, which was now fully repaired and had stopped leaning, which he reported with the satisfaction of a man who has finished something that needed finishing. Colton talked about his cattle, which had come through the early cold better than he'd expected. Her mother talked about a letter from her sister in the East, which had arrived with news Eliza mostly already knew, but which her mother presented as if new, because the telling of it was the point. Eliza talked less than the others. She sat at the table in the kitchen she'd built something in and looked at the people around it, and let herself feel, cleanly and without qualification, that this was worth what it had cost. Not the suffering. She was not going to be sentimental about the suffering, which had been real and unnecessary and imposed by people who had no right to impose it. But the work. The decision in this kitchen on a Sunday morning when Caleb Blackridge had said turn around and something in her had turned inward instead and located the part of herself that would not. That part had known something the rest of her had taken months to catch up to. After dinner, her parents went to bed earlier than usual, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. She and Colton sat at the table with coffee and the comfortable quiet that had been one of the first things she'd trusted about him. "Next year," he said at some point. "Next year," she said. "The third wagon," he said. She smiled. "By fall, maybe." "I think sooner," he said. "The eastern route's going to need it by summer." "Let's get through the hearing first," she said. He looked at her. "You're not worried about the hearing," he said. It wasn't a question. She thought about it honestly. "I'm cautious about it," she said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Worry is when you think something might go wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it," she said. "Caution is when you know something might go wrong and you're making sure you've done everything you can." She looked at her coffee cup. "Beaumont has everything. The freight interference, the water rights pressure, the misrepresentation claim, the history. If a judge looks at it honestly—" "Judges don't always look honestly," he said. "No," she said, "but Park will be there. He told Beaumont he'd testify if asked. A territorial marshal who is willing to say in court what he told me in his office, that Gerald Blackridge came to him and asked him to investigate my operation, and there was nothing to find. That's not nothing." Colton was quiet for a moment. Park came to you, he said. You didn't know he would do that. No, she said. I didn't. People surprised you, he said. It was not a general statement, it was specific. He was observing something she hadn't quite put in those terms to herself. She thought about it. The Ridgeback foreman who kept the contract. The Millhaven foreman who read her letter and acted on the fairness of it rather than the fear. Dorothy's husband who sat at this table and signed his name to something that cost him something. Park, who told her things that weren't strictly in his official capacity. Her mother, who had spoken to the right people quietly and had not told her about it until the thing was done. Yes, she said. People surprised me. That seems important, he said. She looked at him. Why? He considered the question the way he considered all questions, genuinely, without rushing to an answer he hadn't earned. Because you started this thinking you had to do it alone, he said, or nearly alone, and you didn't. This was true. She had started this with the deep conviction of someone who had been told, in every possible register, that she was a burden, that her presence in situations cost people something, and her absence would be a relief. That conviction had been so thorough and so long-standing that even when she'd been building something real, she'd been building it with the underlying assumption that she was the only one who would show up for it. She had been wrong about that. Not entirely wrong. There had been days when she had been the only one who showed up for it, when it had been her and the darkness and the silence and the choice to keep going. Those days were real, and she wouldn't rewrite them. But the story of the past year was not only her story, it was Agnes appearing at the kitchen door in her nightgown when she heard horses. It was Dorothy turning back to her pastry and saying, "I'll ask him." It was her mother with a pencil correcting her spelling and pretending she was doing something else. She had needed people, and people had come, which was not something she'd known how to let happen before. I was wrong about a few things, she said. Not many, Colton said. Enough, she said. He looked at her with the direct, uncalculated attention that had been the first thing she'd trusted about him. The attention of someone who was not managing their impression of you, just looking at you plainly and finding what was there. I've been thinking, he said. I know, she said. You get a look. You've said that before. It keeps being true, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the December dark was complete and the cold pressed against the windows, and the kitchen was warm in the way kitchens are warm when there has been work done in them all day. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the table. He looked at her. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know that I've thought about it for a long time, and that whatever you say, I'm not going anywhere. I want to be clear about that first. She felt something in her chest. Not anxiety, not the braced feeling she'd spent so long carrying. Something warmer and more uncertain than that. The feeling of standing at the edge of something without knowing its depth, but knowing you're going to step forward anyway. All right, she said. I'd like us to make this permanent, he said. The arrangement, all of it. He met her eyes. I'm not good at the language of this. I know that. But I mean it the way I mean the things I'm good at, completely, and with the intention of following through. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a man who had offered water in a field without asking anything in return, who had ridden to Harlan County without being asked, who had sat at this table through a year of difficulty and never once told her what to do, who had said, when she told him she was tired, I know, I believe you're going to win this. She thought about what permanent meant and what it didn't mean, and how different it was from the transaction that had been arranged in this kitchen on a Sunday morning a year and a half ago. That had been a man looking at a woman and saying, turn around. This was a man looking at a woman and saying, I see you as you are, and I want to stay. Yes, she said. He exhaled. The same quiet release she'd seen from him before, the sound of something held carefully for a long time being carefully set down. Good, he said. She smiled. Not the managed, careful smile she'd learned to produce in the years when smiling correctly was survival. The actual one, the one that arrived when something true had just been said. You could have been more romantic about it, she said. I could have been, he agreed. I didn't think you'd want that. I don't, she said. I'm just noting it. He almost smiled. Agnes has gotten to you, he said. The February hearing was held in Harlan County at the Territorial Court Building, which was larger than anything in Red Hollow, but shabbier than Eliza had expected. The walls needed paint, and one of the windows on the north side had a crack that someone had pasted paper over, which she noticed, and which made the whole proceeding feel more ordinary and therefore less frightening. Beaumont had told her to be present, but to let him speak. She was present. She let him speak. He spoke for most of a morning. He laid out the freight charter violations, the water rights pressure, the misrepresentation to Martin, the documented timeline of each action and its relationship to the others. He presented the pattern, which was, she understood now, what he had been building toward from the beginning, from the day he had come to her kitchen and spread 3 sheets of paper on the table in a precise row. Not a collection of individual incidents, but a coherent campaign of interference, conducted by a family using its territorial influence to harm a small operator who had no political power to fight back with, except documentation and law. Park testified. I was brief and precise and said what he'd told her in his office, that Gerald Blackridge had come to him and suggested he investigate Eliza's operation, and that his investigation had found nothing to investigate. He said it with the flat credibility of a man who has been in his position long enough that people know he doesn't embellish. Gerald Blackridge's lawyers cross-examined Beaumont's presentation for the better part of an afternoon. They were good. She could see they were good, could see them finding the gaps and the ambiguities and pressing on them. She sat in the gallery beside Colton and kept her face still and her hands in her lap and listened to people argue about her life in the technical language of law. Colton leaned over once and said very quietly, "Beaumont's not worried." She looked at Beaumont, who was sitting at the front table with the same composure he'd had in her kitchen 9 months ago. "How can you tell?" "He's not moving," Colton said. "Worried people move." The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named Hargrove, who had the face of someone who had heard a great many arguments and had developed the capacity to assess them without being moved by them in either direction. She asked questions of both sides that were specific and without warmth, and which suggested she had read the documentation before arriving in the room, which was not something Eliza had allowed herself to assume. The ruling did not come that day. Hargrove said she would deliver it in writing within 3 weeks, and that both parties should expect a thorough response to the materials presented. They rode back to Red Hollow in the cold with the case in whatever state it was in, undecided, pending, the way too many things had been pending for too long. "How do you think it went?" Eliza said. "Beaumont presented it well," Colton said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I think Hargrove is fair," he said. "I think a fair reading of what Beaumont presented gives her what she needs to rule against the Blackridges. Whether she does it depends on whether she's actually fair." He looked at the road ahead. "I think she is." "So do I," Eliza said. They were both quiet after that. The road was cold and long, and the horses moved at their steady winter pace, and above them the sky was the particular winter blue that looks almost warm until you're standing under it. Beaumont's letter arrived 17 days after the hearing. She opened it at the work table with Agnes standing 2 feet away trying to appear as though she was doing something else. She read it. She read it again. The ruling found in her favor on the freight charter claim. Gerald Blackridge's silent interest in the freight route had been operating outside the terms of its territorial charter, and the evidence of deliberate interference with Eliza's supply was sufficient to constitute actionable misuse. The misrepresentation claim was upheld as well. The statements made to Martin were found to be false and harmful. The court ordered the Blackridge freight interest to be restructured under direct territorial oversight, which effectively ended Gerald's ability to use it as a pressure tool. It ordered financial remedy to Eliza for the documented losses caused by supply interference. The remedy was not large. The frontier did not offer large remedies, and Beaumont had told her not to expect otherwise. But it was real, and it was documented, and it bore the name Blackridge in a court record that was now public. She set the letter down. Agnes said, "Well?" Eliza told her. Agnes made the sound again, the one that was not quite a word, and then turned around and told Dorothy, who told Harriet, who came in from loading the wagon with snow still on her coat to stand in the kitchen and read the letter herself because she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Eliza sent a rider to Colton. Then she went to find her parents. Her father read the letter in the barn, standing under the repaired east wall, and when he finished, he folded it very carefully and handed it back and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I'm proud of you." And the words were so plainly true that she had no defense against them. "Thank you, Pop," she said. Her mother read it at the kitchen table. When she finished, she set it down and aligned it precisely with the edge of the table in the way she aligned things when she was managing a strong response. "Good," Ruth said. "That's all?" Eliza said. Her mother looked up. "What do you want me to say? That I was wrong to push you toward Caleb Blackridge?" Her voice was controlled and even. "I was wrong. I was frightened, and I made the decision that frightened people make, which is the most immediately available one rather than the right one." She looked at her daughter with the directness that was, beneath all the management and the social calculation, the truest thing about Ruth Vance. "I have not always made it easy for you to be who you are." Eliza sat down across from her mother. "No," she said. "Not always." "I'm aware of that," Ruth said. They sat at the kitchen table together in the way that women who have worked side by side in the same kitchen for a year sit together, not as strangers managing their distance, but as people who know each other's habits and have built something in the same room. "You showed up," Eliza said, "every morning." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "It was the least I could do," she said. "It was more than the least," Eliza said. Ruth picked up the letter and aligned it with the table edge again, which meant she was done with the directness for now, and Eliza let it be done. There are things you can say once between a mother and daughter that don't need to be said again. The saying once is enough is the whole thing. What happened to the Blackridge family in the months that followed was not dramatic, which was perhaps the most fitting outcome. Gerald Blackridge did not lose his land or his mill. Caleb did not leave the territory. The family remained the largest single landholder in the Red Hollow district and likely would remain so for years. The court ruling had not destroyed them. It had simply, precisely, formally, in language that appeared in a public record, held them accountable for specific things they had done. This was smaller than the reckoning that people in stories usually got. Eliza knew that. She had known it before the ruling, and she accepted it after. The frontier did not offer clean reckonings. It offered documented truths and legal remedies, and the slow, undramatic accumulation of consequence. Gerald Blackridge's name appeared in a court record as someone who had misused his chartered interests for personal commercial pressure. That record existed. Anyone who wanted to know could read it. She found she could live with that. More than live with it. She found it was actually what she had wanted, which was not revenge and not destruction, but witness. Someone in authority, with the power to look at the full picture, to say, this happened, and it was wrong, and here is what was done about it. That was enough. The bakery expanded that spring, not with a third wagon that came in fall, as Colton had predicted, but with a second shift, which meant Dorothy working mornings and a woman named Vera Hutchins, who had come down from the northern range with her husband and needed work, taking the afternoons. The camps were steady customers now, and word had spread in the way that good, reliable product always spreads on the frontier, where the alternative is uncertain and the need is real. Eliza hired a bookkeeper for 2 days a month, a young man named Percival, who was visibly uncomfortable with the amount of documentation she required him to process, which she considered a sign that he was doing it correctly. She and Colton were married in April. Not a large wedding. The kitchen table had 7 people around it, and Agnes made the cake, and Harriet said afterward that it was the best cake she'd ever tasted, and Dorothy said that was because she was the one who'd actually made it, and Agnes had merely supervised, and Agnes said that supervision was a skill not everyone appreciated. Eliza's mother wore her good dress and said almost nothing during the ceremony itself, which was performed by a justice of the peace with the same brisk efficiency that characterized most frontier paperwork, and wept briefly afterward in a way that she handled by walking to the far end of the yard and standing there until she had managed it, and then returning with her face composed and pouring coffee for everyone as though nothing had happened. Her father shook Colton's hand and said, "You are a decent man," with the gravity of someone issuing a formal verdict, which was, Eliza knew, the highest thing her father knew how to say about a person. They moved into a house on the northern edge of town, not Colton's place on the range, which was too far from the bakery to be practical, and not the Vance Ranch, which was her parents' home and always had been. A third place, which was theirs. It had 4 rooms and a kitchen larger than the one she'd been working in, and when she stood in that kitchen the first morning, she understood that it was the first space she'd ever occupied that was entirely hers, not inherited, not borrowed, not built on someone else's tolerance. She put the tin boxes in the cupboard, not because she'd stopped keeping records. She'd never stopped keeping records, but because they didn't need to be under the bed anymore. They could sit on a shelf in plain sight, which was where documented truth belonged. The third wagon came in September. Harriet trained the new driver, a man named Cole, who had driven freight before and understood roads in the way that people understand things that have cost them something to learn. Agnes reorganized the loading schedule to accommodate 3 routes and produced a chart that she pinned above the work table in the bakery, which Eliza noted without comment was in almost exactly the spot where Beaumont's 2-sentence letter had hung during the worst of things. Years later, not many years, but enough that the children of Red Hollow had grown up knowing the Vance Bakery as an institution rather than an argument, Eliza stood outside on a clear October morning and looked at what the past few years had built. Not a kingdom, not an empire. Those were words for the kind of story where a person starts with nothing and ends with everything, and her story was not that story. Her story was smaller and truer than that. What she had was a bakery that employed 7 people, all of whom had needed the work as much as she had needed their presence. A debt-free ranch where her father tended his cattle and repaired things that needed repairing, and her mother grew herbs in a kitchen garden and lent books to people and spoke her mind in town in ways that no longer required the management of how the Blackridge family might respond. A husband who was at that moment somewhere on the range doing what he did, who would come home in the evening and sit at the table and say what he thought in the fewest words that would carry it, and who had never once, in all the time she'd known him, asked her to be smaller than she was. She had a tin box, 2 of them, now a third, full of records of what she had built and how she had built it and who had tried to stop her and how that had gone. She had Agnes, who was at this moment almost certainly reorganizing something that didn't need reorganizing and finding it improved by the process. She had Dorothy, whose pastry had become so well regarded that the camp sometimes specified it by name in their orders. She had Harriet, who could judge a wagon's roadworthiness by sound, and had never been wrong about it. She had Teddy Marsh, who was no longer 17 and who had quietly learned the accounts alongside her because he had the same instinct for numbers she did. She had a marshal who had told her true things when he didn't have to, and a lawyer in Harlan County who said could be when he meant yes, and a court record with a powerful family's name on it as evidence of what that family had done. She had her mother, who showed up before dawn and kept her opinions largely to the practical, and who had, in the years since all of it, become something Eliza hadn't expected. Not a different woman, not a suddenly warm or demonstrative woman, but an honest one. Ruth had stopped managing the gap between who she was and who she presented herself to be, or had narrowed it, which was as much as most people ever managed. She had her father, who had rebuilt the barn and whose back had not gotten better but who had stopped treating it as something to hide. She had a kitchen that smelled of bread every morning, which was the smell that had first convinced her that she had something worth offering to the world. The hardest thing she had learned, and she had not learned it quickly or gracefully, it had arrived in pieces over months of difficulty and had not finished arriving until sometime after the February hearing, was this: that the story she had been told about herself since childhood, the story in which she was too much and not enough and a burden to the people around her, was not true. It had never been true. It was a story told by people who were frightened of the particular kind of strength that doesn't know how to perform weakness, and who needed her to believe it so that she would become easier to manage. She had believed it for a long time. She had believed it well into the year when she was building something real and still waking at 3 in the morning, afraid that she would cost the people she loved more than she was worth. But you cannot spend a year filling 4 mining camps with bread you made with your own hands, and spend a year with people who show up for the thing you built, and spend a year fighting for the right to keep building it, and still believe that your presence in the world is a problem to be apologized for. At some point, the evidence becomes too clear to argue with. She had taken her time with that evidence. She had looked at it carefully and from multiple angles, and she had been cautious about believing it, the way she was cautious about all things that felt too good to trust quickly. But the evidence had held. It had held through one winter and another, and a court hearing, and 7 employees, and a 3rd wagon, and a marriage built on shared arithmetic and the absence of performance. The evidence held. She let herself believe it. That was not a small thing. She had spent long enough being told it was small to know precisely that it was not. The October morning was cool and clear, and the territory stretched out in every direction the way it always had. Indifferent, demanding, offering nothing and withholding nothing. The same land that had required everything she had and had not once promised her it would be enough. She had learned to love it anyway, with the clear-eyed love of someone who has stopped expecting the world to be fair and started expecting themselves to be capable. She went back inside. The bread was waiting. There was always bread to be made, and she was always the one who knew how to make it, and the knowing was hers in a way that nothing and no one had ever been able to take from her, and she carried it back into the warm kitchen and got to work.